Greetings from the United States. I'm Peter B. Collins. I'm based in San Francisco, and we are very pleased to be participating in the Restorative Justice Global E-Conference. With me today are Lisa Ray. She is the president of Restorative Justice International, which is a proud sponsor of this event. Lisa, great to have you with us.
Great to be here, Peter. Good to see you and Jeff.
And also joining us is Jeffrey Deskovic. He is an exoneree who really, I think, offers us a great example of someone who has been through a wrongful conviction and turned his life into a very, very positive direction. Jeff, it's a real pleasure to have you on this interview today as well.
Thank you for having me.
So, Lisa, let's begin by just describing the work that you do, and I'm going to ask Jeff to do that as well. I'm the moderator here, and by way of introduction, I am the president of the Freedom Foundation, which was initiated by a prisoner at San Quentin, which is just down the road from me here in California. And the organization goes back to the 1970s. I'm also glad to be a member of the Global Advisory Council of Restorative Justice International. So Lisa, take a couple of minutes here to talk about your background and what has brought you to this global effort to promote restorative justice throughout the criminal justice systems.
Great, excellent. Well, I've been in this field for close to 25 years, which is kind of amazing to think that it's been that long. But I've had a passion for restorative justice since I worked for Justice Fellowship, which is an affiliate group of Prison Fellowship Ministries. And I was actually their lobbyist in California, advocating for restorative justice in the 90s. Right after working for Justice Fellowship, I formed a national organization called the Justice and Reconciliation Project. And its focus was in the US. And we worked with crime victims who supported restorative justice and wanted to see change in the justice system. So that organization was national. And after that, I had so many contacts internationally because I did some work with Prison Fellowship International. I had contacts around the world. And I started messing around, to be honest, in social media at LinkedIn. And I started organizing there. And over the years, all of a sudden, Restorative Justice International came together, which is quite amazing to me. But it's really, it's a grassroots effort. And I now have 6,100 members and affiliates that are part of RJI. And we do a lot online. We do it through LinkedIn and through Facebook, but we have global conversations about restorative justice and criminal justice reform. We also have a global advisory council, which Jeff and you are a part of, but there are 12 countries that are represented inside that council. And the council is just incredible, made up of human rights activists, crime victims, pastors, Jeff as an exoneree, justice reform activists and academics. So we are really a global leader in advocacy around restorative justice.
And Jeff, share part of your story with our viewers today, because it is remarkable. As a teenager, you were wrongly accused of the rape and murder of a high school classmate, and you had a difficult odyssey, but it ultimately ended in your finding of innocence and your regaining your freedom. And you've gone on to go to law school and have passed the bar in New York State, and you become very active with your own foundation, the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation.
Exactly right, Peter. At age 16, I was arrested and falsely accused of murder and rape of a high school classmate, which I did not commit. By the time the trial rolled around and I lost, I was 17. I was wrongfully convicted of that crime. I spent 16 years in prison from age 17 to 32. I lost 7 appeals. I got turned down for parole. My wrongful conviction happened by a coerced false confession, prosecutorial misconduct, fraud by the medical examiner, terrible public defender. Ultimately, I was exonerated by further DNA testing via the data bank, which not only reaffirmed my innocence, but also identified the actual perpetrator, who was subsequently arrested and convicted. So I was an individual advocate for about 5 years. I was doing speaking engagements. I was a weekly columnist. I was trading privacy for awareness by doing a lot of multimedia interviews, and I was regularly meeting with elected officials. After about 5 years, I took some of the compensation that I received, and I started the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice for the purpose of freeing similarly situated people to myself. So we've been able to free 7 people in 7 years. We also have a policy initiative in which we seek to pass legislation aimed at preventing wrongful conviction. I'm on the advisory board of the National Coalition Group, It Could Happen to You, which has helped pass the country's first Commission on Prosecutor Conduct, tweak the same, and then discovery reform. I'm also on the Global Advisory Council for Restorative Justice International, where I serve as their in-house expert on wrongful conviction and other criminal justice matters. Wrapping up, I was able to get a scholarship from Mercy College, which I used to get a bachelor's degree when I was released. I then got a master's degree from John Jay College, where my thesis was written on wrongful conviction cause and reform. And as you mentioned, in May 2019, I graduated law school and I passed the bar exam. And I'm just a couple of small steps away from getting my law license.
Jeff, I just want you to know I'm tingling right now, because every time I hear your story, I feel the pain that you endured, but I also have just such respect for the way you have determined to spend your life to address this important series of injustices that are visited on far too many people in the U.S. justice system and beyond. And Jeff, there also is a new documentary about your story. Tell us a little about that.
Yes, it's called Conviction. It's currently available on Amazon Prime. It's a short documentary. It's about 20 minutes, and work is being done on it right now to expand it to an hour and 20 minutes long. Again, I want my story to reach as many people as I can, as but one example of many wrongful convictions, with a hope that it will inspire legislators across the country and nationally and ultimately internationally at passing measures to improve the accuracy of the justice system, and hopefully inspire others to do exonerative work and to contribute in one way or another to the overall movement.
Yeah. Well, Lisa, could you give us your view of the connection between restorative justice and wrongful conviction?
Okay, yeah, I will do that. Let me explain how I met Jeff, for one. Jeff, I was watching Jeff online because I meet a lot of people, justice activists in this country and around the world, online. And I saw him tell his story via Facebook. And I tracked him down, and we had a brief conversation, and I immediately thought, my gosh, we have to do a podcast. And so RJI does podcasts nationally and globally. We've done 30 or 31 to date. Each one will be in the US and one will be outside the country. And I asked Jeff, come on, let's do a podcast. And we did that. I think it was 2 years ago, right, Jeff?
Yes.
But it was immediately something I was excited about, to hear his story, to hear the change he was making around the world, really, not just the United States. But let me backtrack a little bit. I've always been interested in wrongful convictions, partly by meeting Dennis Jones and knowing about the Freedom Foundation through you, Peter. But also I met a man named Greg Wilhoit. And Greg Wilhoit was on death row in Oklahoma. And I met him because he was exonerated in Oklahoma off a death row. But I met him at an event in Texas where I met a number of exonerees, and Greg told me his story. And it was astounding because he was convicted of killing his wife, and he was convicted due to bite marks on her body, on her back. That was the only evidence. And when he got out, he received absolutely no compensation. And it broke my heart, to be honest, broke my heart. And he ended up coincidentally moving to Sacramento, where I lived in that region, and we became friends. He's gone today. He died about 5 years ago, a very early death. And I just saw the impact of wrongful convictions on the innocent, including somebody on death row. So anyway, Jeff and I have worked together since that time, and we have we've put wrongful convictions on our agenda, on our public policy agenda, because it's connected. And the reason is, if you got the wrong person in prison or on death row for a crime they did not commit, then you got the wrong person. That's one victim. And then the original victim gets no justice. And then the perpetrator is still free, perhaps, or maybe in prison, but not convicted for that crime. It's injustice. It's just not right. And because restorative justice is really about making change to a broken justice system, we add it to our agenda and say, no, we need to address all injustices, because restorative justice provides a vision for a new justice system based on real justice.
And initially, your work was in victim offender reconciliation, but you have expanded to address the systemic issues in criminal justice process.
Yes, actually, that's not quite right. But when I worked for Justice Fellowship in California, our focus was bringing restorative justice inside the California criminal justice system. So I was the director, the state director of Justice Fellowship, when in the Capitol during those years in the 90s, restorative justice was not known. I had contacts on the left and on the right. I had worked for 3 Democrats in the legislature, and I remember members and staff saying to me, "What is this?" and also, "You and who else wants this?" And I had to explain, well, actually, this is a national effort. There's support for this around the country, and they didn't see it. But at that time, we were working on legislation that wasn't just about victim offender dialogue, and I say dialogue now and not reconciliation, but we were working on supporting community corrections for nonviolent offenders. So diverting offenders out of prison into restorative justice type programs, or making sure they don't go in the first place, especially for nonviolent offenders. So we had legislation actually in 1994 that my organization authored, sponsored, and we didn't get it signed, but we got a bill that we liked pretty much that did get signed by Pete Wilson, Governor Pete Wilson. So, but you're right in that victim offender dialogue was something that most people equated restorative justice with. They thought that's kind of what it is. Well, it's not what it is. It's one little piece. And I always say, and we say this on our video that's on the front of our website that introduces RJI, restorative justice is not a program. And Peter, you do the narration of that video, and I thank you very much for that. But it's not a program, and people think it is. They think it's like, okay, you just put that into the system and there's restorative justice, but it's not. And I think, you know, what you did say is, I think restorative justice, the movement has evolved over the years. And you can imagine, 25 years, has my work changed? You bet it's changed. It's changed a lot. But we've always understood that the system's broken. It doesn't work for crime victims. It doesn't work for offenders, and it certainly doesn't work for those who were innocent in our system. But it's a vision that allows us to move away from mass incarceration towards a healing justice.
So Jeff, share with our viewers and the international audience your sense of how restorative justice can play out effectively in your case as an exoneree. You know, I understand that you've actually spent time with the family of the victim in the case where you were wrongfully convicted. And let's name her. Her name was Angela Correa. Tell us about that experience and the other ways that restorative processes have been important for you since you were released.
So I attended the sentencing of the actual perpetrator of the crime because I considered that he victimized me by remaining silent while I was doing time for his crime, just as he, victimized Angela Correa by, murdering her and raping her. So when I attended the sentencing, Angela's mother, who's also named Angela Correa, she went to court and she read a victim impact statement. And part of it, she mentioned that he was silent while I was doing time for his crime. But then she also made a pretty dramatic statement, which she said, I invite everybody who played a part in what happened to me to bow their heads in shame. So I thought it was pretty profound and it moved me emotionally. And we were outside the courtroom. She sent the officer who had been assigned to her to keep her company to come and speak to me and asked if I would be willing to talk to her. And I did. I came over there and we had a emotional, tearful embrace. I felt like she was very moved by what happened to me. And just putting in context that I had briefly met her at her house when the victim was buried. Everybody at the cemetery was offered to come back to the family home for coffee and pastry, and so I had briefly met her there, and we exchanged phone numbers. And about a month later, she called me, and I spent several weekends with them in their house. And it started off. It was a little bit awkward, because I had been not only wrongfully imprisoned of her daughter and her other sister, but then I had falsely confessed at that. But I explained to them why I falsely confessed, and I explained about that I was, taken across county lines, that I was 16 years old, that it was a 7-hour interrogation, that I was threatened, and there was false promises, and everything ended with my collapsing into a fetal position on the ground, crying uncontrollably, and they understood. And it was healing to get that understanding and to have them accept my innocence. And then I also got to hear and understand their pain when they mentioned to me, that they all this time they thought that, I was the actual perpetrator. And so, they had some strong feelings about me in terms of the mother, but, while the sister had doubts about my guilt. So, we just kind of bonded over that. And I felt healed. And I know that they did too, because here we were linked together by the actual perpetrator. So using that as an example, I see restorative justice crossing over into the field of wrongful conviction by similar dialogues. I know as an exoneree, I yearned but didn't see how I could talk to the crime victim family to, again, express that I was innocent and explain how I was wrongfully convicted. And I really, so deeply, I needed to have that heard and to be accepted. And I wanted to hear what their feelings were. I mean, they needed to let go, the thinking that I, killed their family member. So it really, they use that as an example of that. I could also see restorative justice applying in wrongful conviction between, say, maybe the prosecutor or detectives that were involved in arresting the wrong person, or say a crime victim misidentifying the person who was wrongfully imprisoned. So I see it as applying on those levels. And I also believe that there is room where law enforcement should have similar dialogues with the crime victims, because it's their error that led to the wrong person being arrested, and then they have to have it explained, so the scab is ripped off of the wound again. So and certainly the other family, because the actual perpetrator had killed a second victim who was a school teacher and had 2 children. So I could see where there was room for restorative justice between law enforcement and the second crime victim's family, because if the police had done their job in the right way, then the second victim would have been killed. I would just super briefly just like to put a little color to what Lisa had said in terms of us working together. So in New York, the It Could Happen to You Coalition, we were on the verge of passing a bill called the Commission on Prosecutor Conduct, which was would have been the country's first oversight board for prosecutors. And the governor was hesitating as to whether he was going to sign the bill or not. So I had reached out to Lisa following the podcast, and RJI. They wrote a memo of support, which I think was very influential. And they also wrote an op-ed, which the daily newspaper in Westchester County, the Journal News, published. I was able to facilitate on that. And we've just been working together ever since on other justice reform measures. And lastly, I do want to mention, in terms of RJI's wrongful conviction commitment, just another facet is that RJI does, they do interview people who are running for district attorney on a progressive plank, which obviously must include wrongful conviction prevention program. How are they going to do that within the office? What policies are they going to support? And of course, restorative justice. And so, I am able to connect RJI to various candidates. And
Mhm.
I also give my opinion on other candidates that I may not have originated. The idea might not have originated with me, but I help to review, the resume and their plank. So it's been very meaningful. And so Lisa and I also, we wrote several articles, not just one. We wrote an article entitled Wrongful Conviction and Restorative Justice, What's the Connection? So we wrote that, we got that published, and then there's an additional piece which is on the RJI website. Lastly, I'll just say that exonerees and crime victims, we're not enemies. We're on the same side. It's only when people take extreme positions that we may come into opposition. But in many ways, we're all crime victims, and that's one of the initiatives RJI is doing. I mean, exonerees should be looked at as crime victims, and therefore be eligible for various services that other crime victims would be eligible, which would relate to reintegrating back into society.
And Peter, can I tag on to that? Yeah, so Jeff's comment, I thought of two things. One is it's so important for exonerees to be considered under law as victims. And in California, there's a case that we've been active on, Maurice Caldwell, who is an innocent man who is not seen as a victim of crime. And we have taken steps to support the fact that legally he should be considered that so he can be compensated. Now, the state of California has a victims compensation fund, and they've denied him so far any kind of compensation because they don't acknowledge that he is a victim. We think that's incorrect, and that's a really important point because nationally or globally, it should be seen as victims. I get into these conversations actually online with exonerees where they say, you're supporting this restorative justice stuff, but what do you think of us? And I say, well, I think you're a victim of crime. And statutorily, that's a whole nother deal. And then I just want to also add on to what Jeff said about the effort that we've, the campaign in essence that we've been involved in to support and elect candidates running for district attorney. I mean, it's very critical. It's a new process for us, but we've done some really incredible work. And some of the, Jeff can add on to this, but some of the candidates we have supported is Mimi Roca, who will be the next district attorney of Westchester County, New York. She's a dynamic woman, and she supports restorative justice, has a platform on wrongful convictions and other really good things. And also we supported Chesa Bodine in San Francisco early, and we did a podcast with him. He's a dynamic prosecutor in San Francisco doing some groundbreaking work and supports restorative justice. And then there's Eli Sabat in Washtenaw County, Michigan, and also Matt Toporowski in New York, in Albany, New York, who didn't make it, but he'll give it another try, I'm sure. But that's been really an important departure for us because no one that I know in this field in restorative justice are getting out there and looking at candidates and realize how important it is to elect people who support our agenda, restorative justice. And that doesn't apply just to prosecutors, it applies to public officials, any public official.
I want to add also, in the course of Matt Toporowski's run, as Lisa mentioned, although he didn't get elected, he did significantly further the issues because he inserted those issues, into the election. So regardless of that outcome of the particular election, the issue was furthered, and that's very significant.
So let me ask you each to comment on this. I've examined hundreds of wrongful convictions. And there are a handful that I would consider to be unintentional, where there were errors made in eyewitness identification and similar aspects of the trial process. But fundamentally, it boils down to misconduct by police and by prosecutors who in general face no consequences. And putting aside the legal remedies that I think are necessary to deal with this kind of official misconduct, have you seen cases where they have shown remorse for sending someone to prison for decades? Because let me just use an example that even our international audience is probably aware of, the Central Park Five. Ken Burns and his daughter produced a powerful documentary. Ava DuVernay did a more entertainment-oriented approach to the case. But the bottom line is that they suffered similarly to Jeff, where false confessions were extracted from teenagers who then were just, there was no looking back from that point. And to this day, the prosecutor in New York who put away the Central Park Five is unapologetic. And so, even short of legal consequences, I believe there's one prosecutor in Texas who your Innocence Project attorney, Jeff, successfully prosecuted and did 6 days in jail for a wrongful conviction, if I remember correctly, of a man who spent 30 years in prison. So is there any expression of remorse or even a willingness to address the failure in the prosecutions by the teams who conducted the wrongful convictions? Jeff, let me start with you.
Yeah, just in general, no. That's part of the problem, and I do think that that's another area where restorative justice can help to alter that culture. In terms of specific case you were referring to, that was the Michael Morton case. People can watch the documentary, which is called an Unreal Dream, and that prosecutor's misconduct of withholding evidence and blocking testing, cost Michael 25 years in prison. And while the prosecutor, there was a rare example of a prosecutor going to jail, he did a handful of jails, a handful of days, and Michael did 25, and then they let him out on good time at that. It wasn't even, there was one other case, that was the Mike Nafong from the Duke lacrosse case. But those are the only examples, and there's been a lack of accountability, and that is a big problem. That's what encourages the other prosecutors, to just continue on with it, because they see that really nothing happens. There was a really remarkable example there was a former prosecutor, his last name was Stroud, and he wrote this really remarkable op-ed that was published pertaining to when he had wrongfully convicted. He put Glenn Ford on death row, and by the time Glenn was exonerated, he already had advanced cancer, and he passed away not too long after that. And the reason why Stroud wrote the op-ed is that the state didn't want to give him any compensation, so the op-ed was encouraging them to do that, and ultimately he never got a penny. Certainly, in terms of my case in particular, I got a symbolic apology from the prosecutor that was in the courtroom when I was exonerated, and similar to the judge that presided over that proceeding. But the frustrating part of it for me was that the prosecutor who had wrongfully convicted me and engaged in misconduct, and the trial judge who presided over the trial, none of the original people ever apologized to me. And had they done so, that would have given me some kind of closure, and just to have that official acknowledgement, something wrong was done to me and that I was completely innocent. That would have added a lot.
So yeah, it's perfect segue. This is exactly where restorative justice comes to play, because it is about holding offenders accountable. So when you're talking about the justice system, or a prosecutor, or a police officer, or a police chief, or investigator, whoever they are, they need to be held accountable for their actions. So it is the perfect connection there. And as Jeff just said, for so many exonerees, they don't get that apology. They don't hear that remorse. They don't hear, I'm sorry for what the 20 years that I took of your life. Well, that's wrong. And that's why it's so critical to have the prosecutorial conduct commissions that Jeff and his organization, and ITCHE, the organization in New York, that they're supporting, and we're joining them in support of, because those commissions need to be set up around the country, and not just here. This is an international problem of miscarriages of justice, but we need to hold those people accountable. And should they do time? Well, they need to do something more than they're doing now, which is walking away or staying in office, right? To continue these injustices.
Or being promoted to judge, which
Right,
often,
right. And, you
Right.
know, well, I can also say, and I won't go too far on this, but, you know, offender accountability in the justice system, that goes all the way to the top of our justice system. Whenever there's injustice that occurs, any part of our system, we need to hold those people accountable. Wherever they are, you know, if they're a state legislator, if it's a district attorney, or even if it's a president of the United States or any other public official.
and let me ask you each just to briefly comment on this. We are experiencing mass protests in the United States aimed at police misconduct, including the shooting of unarmed people, most often African Americans. Do you see that restorative justice is being considered as part of the reform movement? Jeff, you first, please.
Yeah, yes, I do, because you know there are different programs in certain prisons where you know where restorative justice is at, and so you know crime victims come in, and not necessarily the crime victim of a particular prisoner, but they come in, and you know the other people have committed violent crimes, and so there's this dialogue. You know there are recordings of it, and it's very powerful and inspirational to watch. You know certainly you know some jurisdictions as well can apply restorative justice after incarceration when someone is released. So there is that. And last quick comment I'll make is, while the national focus has been specifically on police reform, we also need to not leave the prosecutors, you know, behind, because you know they're the ones who are not prosecuting police officers when they engage in unjustifiable deadly police force. They're not prosecuting police officers who commit brutality. You know, they're using confessions, even if they're obtained under highly questionable circumstances. They're using identifications that were made under very suggestive procedures. Sometimes they're withholding evidence, and their job is as a minister of justice, and that means prosecuting the guilty with legally obtained evidence while not violating anyone's right to a fair trial and dismissing cases, you know, against innocent people. And that's at any stage. And the sad pattern that's happening frequently is they seek to preserve convictions no matter what. And that's why the average length of wrongful imprisonment is 14 years. And by the time people are exonerated, typically their appeals have been exhausted. So we need more buy-in from the prosecutorial community. And that's another reason why, you know, restorative justice really has a place, because it's seeking to get buy-in from people generally ahead of time so that it's easier to then carry out in individual cases.
Yeah, Peter, it's a really good question. RJI supports restorative policing. In 2016, we convened a global committee to look at restorative policing, which is something that's supported more outside the US than inside. But what it is it's a way of responding to police encounters that in essence hold police officers accountable for their behavior. But it also de-escalates any tension that occurs between citizens and police officers. That's really the point. But it's applying restorative justice principles to policing. So in 2016, after about a year of global experts on restorative justice, policing, justice officials, and others, they came together and they wrote a white paper. And it's up on our site, so you can find it, RJI's white paper on restorative policing. And it's quite a document. It was driven by two individuals. One is Dr. Paul McCold from Oakland, California. He's a criminologist. He was on our council at that time. And also Terry O'Connell from Australia. He was a police officer for many years, and he really was the one who's driven restorative policing because of his own experiences and actually applying it on the beat. So after the white paper, we also did a webinar with those two individuals that I moderate, which is also on the website. But it's something we need to look at now in this country and outside the country, wherever there's police violence. Again, it's the idea of holding police accountable, creating more peace in our communities, right? And then making sure that those who are offenders, who are police officers, are held directly accountable for their actions.
Well, this has been a great conversation. As we wrap up, final comments from each of you, and feel free to mention things that you want to bring to people's attention in the Global E-Conference that we didn't get to touch on today? Jeff, can you go first?
Yeah, just that, you know, there is, in all the ways that we mentioned in this interview, there is a definite relationship between an application of restorative justice to wrongful conviction. If anyone would like to follow my work, you know, as far as interviews and speaking engagements and other advocacy initiatives, you know, I do have a public figure page on Facebook, Jeffrey Deskovic, and I'd love to have people follow what I'm doing, just like RJI has a page on social media as well.
And Lisa?
Yeah, so I think what we want people to walk away with when they're watching this interview around the world is that restorative justice is really about systemic justice reform. And so when you put it in a box and you say, well, it's just, you know, bringing healing to crime victims, and you leave it there, well, that's not the big vision. It really takes on any injustice, which then also means that we're going to take on wrongful convictions, because what we're seeking is we want to stop wrongful convictions. We don't want more Jeff Deskovics. We don't want that. We don't want the Innocence Project to grow. We want more justice. We want healing for those who are hurting by crime, but we want offenders to be held accountable when they are the actual offender. And we certainly want to bring justice to people like Jeff. And so I encourage people to look at our website and work with us and join us if you can. So thank you so much, Peter, for moderating today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Lisa Ray, Jeff Deskovic, thank you for a great conversation. And let's thank Martin Howard and all the people who have organized the Restorative Justice Global E-Conference. Good day.